Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Johnson, for what purposes Mr. Johnson seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3843, offered by Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Strike Section 3.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American people are deeply concerned about the anti-competitive actions and censorship abuses of big tech. That's what's brought us here, and infamously, the big platforms have suppressed and silenced conservatives in particular and conservative viewpoints. We all know it. Objectively, that's true. They have brazenly weaponized their biases, and it concerns everybody, not just those on our side of the aisle, because it's ultimately a threat to free speech everywhere and to all viewpoints. And in many cases, they've also eroded the free market and ultimately closed down the operations of many small businesses, job creators, and entrepreneurs. Many of us believe our focus should be on how to enforce the current antitrust laws and how we use those to address the anti-competitive behavior. So my amendment is pretty simple. It would insert the text of my bill, the One Agency Act, into H.R. 3843. For more than 100 years, enforcement of our country's antitrust laws has been split between the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. In light of today's markup, I think it's fair to ask what the American people have gotten for their tax dollars. The split jurisdiction in executing our antitrust laws has created an untenable bureaucratic process with poor communication among the enforcement bodies, unreasonable delays, and an unacceptable level of inconsistency in administering the current law. Take one example. In a recent antitrust case brought against a company by the FTC, the DOJ filed a motion in support of the company both at the trial level and on appeal. In other words, the DOJ and the FTC were arguing the opposite sides. The DOJ said the FTC was wrong. We had two federal agencies tasked with enforcing antitrust law openly arguing against one another in federal court. On top of that, the FTC's case was so problematic that the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy also weighed in at the appellate level in support of the defendant company. This is the very definition of a broken system, and it's what the taxpayers get when there's an utter lack of consistency. Considering the subject matter of today's markup, I think the majority would agree with me that the process has just not worked as it was intended. Again, Mr. Chairman, my amendment is simple. It would consolidate antitrust enforcement within the Department of Justice. The FTC would still be able to carry out its consumer protection functions, which are important, but competition enforcement would fall squarely within the DOJ's antitrust division. This would improve our ability to police anti-competitive behavior by streamlining our efforts at the federal level. For that reason, I urge a yes vote on my amendment, and I yield back.
Does Mr. Cicilline insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will be heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this piece of legislation before us is a very narrow piece of legislation with respect to fees for proposed mergers. The amendment is a gigantic, substantively different piece of legislation, in fact, that abolishes the FTC. That is not germane to the narrow purpose of the underlying bill, and I ask you to rule it.
Would the gentleman yield? Would you yield for a moment?
Sure.
This,
I don't typically yield if someone's going to argue against me, but for you, Mr. Johnson, I'll do it.
You're a good friend. If you read the text of the amendment, it doesn't abolish the FTC. As I acknowledged in my opening, there's an important function that the FTC is involved in. That's consumer protection. That was its intent.
I'm sorry. I'll correct that. You are absolutely right. It abolishes the antitrust enforcement of the FTC, which is a huge policy. It's a broad policy proposal, which is well beyond the very narrow purpose of an increase in filing fees, and therefore I think it's not germane.
Could I ask if you think that's running efficiently and effectively as designed?
Look, I think the subcommittee, the antitrust subcommittee, spent 2 years studying this issue of antitrust, and I think we generated reports, both a majority report and minority report, that I think bring very needed reforms to this work. And I think there have been failings on both Democratic and Republican administrations. That's what this body of bills is intended to do, but more antitrust enforcement, not less, to me is the answer. But that's, again, not the issue. This is a germinaneous question. I'll yield to Mr. Buck, who looks like he wants to.
With the gentleman.
Of course.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask the gentleman, I believe that, Mr. Johnson, correct me if I'm wrong, that Senator Lee has offered this bill in the United States Senate.
Yeah, I think so.
And I'm just wondering if the ranking member on the Antitrust Subcommittee would be willing to look at this bill separately, aside from today's markup, and be willing to work towards maybe some resolution on this bill.
Absolutely. Happy to work with you, Mr. Buck, and Mr. Johnson.
And I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair is prepared to rule. Clause 7 of House Rule 16 prohibits amendments that are on a different subject matter than the proposal that is under consideration. The subject of the bill we are currently considering is the levels of Hart-Scott-Rodino fees. The gentleman's amendment proposes to restructure bureaus in DOJ and FTC, a much broader proposition, which is a subject that is different from what we are considering in this bill. The amendment is therefore not germane and violates Clause 7 of Rule 16.